Imagine the Red Square in Moscow. The year is 1977. The snow is falling on the cobblestones. The air is shaking with the roar of diesel engines. You see column after column of T-72 tanks. You see the massive mobile launchers of the intercontinental ballistic missiles. You see the stone-faced generals in their heavy wool coats standing on top of Lenin's Mausoleum, saluting a machine that looks unstoppable. We are taught in school that this was the Soviet Union at its peak. We are told this was the era of the superpower. We are told that the world trembled because the Russian bear was strong. But that is a fairy tale. That is a lie told by propaganda posters and repeated by lazy historians. If you strip away the marching music and the red flags, and you look at the only thing that matters, the ledger, you will see a very different reality. You won't see a superpower. You will see a dead man walking. You will see a corporation that is cooking its books to hide a bankruptcy so massive it would eventually swallow half the world. Those tanks rolling past the Kremlin were not assets. They were liabilities. Every single one of them was a piece of metal that cost millions to build and thousands to maintain and produced absolutely zero economic value. They were not protecting the economy. They were eating it. We look at the Cold War and we see a chess match of ideologies. Communism versus capitalism. Freedom versus tyranny. But it wasn't a chess match. It was a poker game where one player was betting with a credit card that had already been declined. Leonid Brezhnev didn't build a military to defend the Soviet Union. He built a military that foreclosed on the Soviet Union. To understand the heist, we have to identify the villain. The villain is not a person. It isn't even the Communist Party. The villain is a financial concept called parity. It is the delusional belief that a country with an economy half the size of the United States could spend dollar for dollar with the United States without breaking its spine. The seed of this financial suicide was planted in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union blinked. They had to back down because they knew they were weaker. The generals in Moscow were humiliated. They went to the new leader, Leonid Brezhnev, and they made a demand that sounded patriotic but was actually suicidal. They said, never again. They demanded that the Soviet Union must reach absolute mathematical parity with the Americans. If the Americans have 1,000 missiles, we must have 1,000 missiles. If they have 10 aircraft carriers, we must have 10. Brezhnev agreed. He signed the check, but he didn't check the bank account. In the United States, military spending was a heavy tax, but it was manageable, usually around 6 or 7% of GDP. In the Soviet Union, because of the obsession with parity, that number began to climb. It hit 10%, then 15%. By the early 1980s, modern forensic accountants estimate that the Soviet Union was spending 25% of its entire gross domestic product on weapons. Think about the insanity of that leverage. 1 out of every 4 rubles created by the labor of the Soviet people was being taken out of the economy and welded into a submarine that would sit in the dark under the Arctic ice doing nothing. This wasn't defense, it was a liquidation of the national wealth. The mechanism of this theft was controlled by a group known in Moscow as the Metal, word of the Metal Eaters. This was the military-industrial lobby. In a normal country, if a factory is inefficient, it goes bankrupt. In the Soviet Union, if a factory was inefficient, but it made tank parts, it got a budget increase. The Metal Eaters had what was called the first claim. This is a term that should terrify any economist. It meant that the military had the legal right to the best of everything before the civilian economy got a single scrap. The best steel went to the tank factories, the best aluminum went to the Air Force, but the most tragic theft was the human capital. The Soviet Union had some of the most brilliant mathematical and scientific minds of the 20th century. But where did they work? They didn't work on designing better cars for the people. They didn't work on modernizing the agricultural system, which was still stuck in the 19th century. They worked on guidance systems. They worked on radar. They worked on death. The civilian sector was left with the dregs. This is why Soviet televisions exploded. This is why Soviet shoes fell apart after a week. This is why the shelves in the grocery stores were empty. It wasn't because the Soviet Union couldn't produce things. It was because the Metal Eaters were starving the civilian economy to feed the military machine. The country was hemorrhaging its brain power into a black hole of classified projects that generated no return on investment. The most egregious example of this financial malpractice was the Navy. The Soviet Union was a land power. Its borders were on land. Its enemies were on land. It did not need a global blue water navy to defend itself. But the United States had a global navy, so Brezhnev decided he needed one too. Under the command of Admiral Gorshkov, the Soviets began the largest naval buildup in history. They built cruiser after cruiser. They built nuclear submarines by the dozen. They even started building aircraft carriers, which are the single most expensive items a nation can purchase. These ships were magnificent feats of engineering. They were beautiful, and they were useless. A navy is a tool for projecting power to protect trade routes. But the Soviet Union didn't have global trade routes. They were building a fleet to protect nothing. Every time a Kiev-class aircraft carrier was launched, it was the financial equivalent of burning down a medium-sized city. The maintenance costs alone were astronomical. A ship begins to rust the moment it hits the water. It needs crews, it needs fuel, it needs parts. Brezhnev was buying Ferraris for a country that couldn't afford to pave its roads. He was projecting the image of a global empire while the foundation at home was turning to sand. The admirals got their medals, but the budget got a hole in it that could never be patched. If the Navy was vanity, the nuclear program was insanity. By the mid-1970s, the Soviets had achieved their goal. They had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the United States 10 times over. A rational board of directors would have stopped spending. They would have said, "We are safe, let's invest in computers." But the metal eaters didn't want to stop. They invented a new product to sell to the Politburo, the SS-20 Sabre. This was a medium-range mobile missile. It was a technological marvel, and it was a strategic disaster. By deploying the SS-20 targeting Europe, the Soviets didn't make themselves safer. They panicked the Europeans. This led directly to NATO inviting the Americans to deploy Pershing II missiles in West Germany. The Pershing II was a gun held to the head of Moscow with a 6-minute flight time. So what did the Soviets do? Did they negotiate? No. They spent even more money to counter the threat that they had created. It was a feedback loop of bankruptcy. They bought a missile. The American response made that missile obsolete. So they bought a more expensive missile. They were buying their own insecurity. They were running on a treadmill that was moving faster and faster, printing rubles, to pay for hardware that was obsolete before it left the factory floor. They were caught in a classic security dilemma. But the price was paid in the complete stagnation of the Soviet standard of living. Now you might ask, how did they sustain this for 18 years? How did the country not collapse in 1975? The answer is luck. Dumb, blind luck. In 1973, the price of oil quadrupled. The Soviet Union discovered massive oil fields in Siberia. At the exact moment the world was desperate for energy, billions of petrodollars flooded into the Kremlin's coffers. This windfall should have been the savior of the Soviet Union. It should have been used to modernize the factories, to buy new technology, to reform the system. But Brezhnev was a bad CEO. He treated the oil revenue like a winning lottery ticket. He used it to plug the holes in the budget. He used it to import grain from America because his own collective farms were failing. And most of all, he used it to double down on military spending. The oil money masked the rot. It allowed the Soviet Union to live beyond its means for a decade. It created a false sense of security. They thought they were rich, but they were just liquidating their natural resources to pay for their military addiction. This is known in economics as the Dutch disease, but the Soviets had a terminal case. They became a petrol state with nuclear missiles. They pegged the survival of their empire to the price of a barrel of crude oil. And when the price of oil eventually crashed in the 1980s, the floor fell out from under the tank factories. By 1979, the bill was coming due, and Brezhnev made the final fatal error. He ordered the invasion of Afghanistan. We usually talk about the lives lost or the military tactics, but look at the ledger. Afghanistan was a financial hemorrhage. It was a war that cost billions of rubles a year to fight, to supply an army in a country with no infrastructure, to fly helicopters in thin air to bribe local warlords. It was a sunk cost trap. They kept pouring money in because they were afraid to admit it was a bad investment. And while they were bleeding in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, the Americans played their masterstroke. Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. He proposed a space-based shield to shoot down Soviet missiles. Technologically, it was a fantasy. It didn't work, but financially it was a weapon of mass destruction. The Soviet generals panicked. They told the Politburo, if the Americans build a shield, our entire investment in missiles is worthless. They demanded a budget to build a Soviet Star Wars. They demanded space lasers and supercomputers. But the Soviet economy was broken. They didn't have the microchips. They didn't have the money. They were like a broke gambler trying to match a billionaire's bet. The threat of Star Wars forced the Soviet Union to sprint when it was already having a heart attack. It broke the will of the leadership because they finally looked at the balance sheet and realized we cannot afford this game anymore. Brezhnev died in 1982, leaving a corpse on the throne. The momentum of his spending carried the Union for a few more years, but the math was undeniable. When Mikhail Gorbachev took over, he tried to stop the machine. He tried to convert the military factories to civilian use, but it was too late. The economy was so distorted, so warped by 40 years of preparing for war, that it couldn't be fixed. It was structurally dependent on the defense sector. When they stopped building tanks, the economy didn't pivot. It collapsed. The $600 billion military machine turned out to be a rust belt that nobody wanted. The empire didn't end with a nuclear explosion. It ended with a default. It ended because the credit line ran out. Today, if you go to the naval graveyards near Murmansk, you can see the receipts. You can see the rusting hulks of the battle cruisers that Brezhnev bought with the people's money. They sit there poisoning the water. Silent monuments to the idea that you can buy security by bankrupting your society. The lesson of the Soviet collapse is not about the failure of Marxism. It is about the failure of accounting. Empires don't die by murder. They die by suicide. They die when they forget that the true source of national power is not the number of missiles in your silos, but the solvency of your treasury. I'm James, and this is The Hidden Balance. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. Don't forget to subscribe. Join those who see what others ignore.